Good afternoon, everyone here at this panel at the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development on Controlling Arms Flows to Conflict, Lessons from the Nagorno-Karabakh Conflict. What we're going to do in the coming hour, so from now 12:30 to 13:30, we're going to have a dialogue, a conversation between several experts with some input from you, the audience, hopefully too. If you have input, as you already could see before, please use the question and answer box, which you can open, and there you can put your observations, your questions, and I will try as a moderator to insert those into the discussion whenever I think it is most relevant. Or the panelist may also pick on those particular observations and questions themselves. What we're going to talk about today is, well, starting, you could say, we're going to talk about the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, and particularly we're going to look at the role that international arms transfers played in the, you could say, escalation to conflict in 2020, the escalation to a full-scale war, which lasted for 6 weeks and cost the life of about 6,000 people in the immediate events, not to talk about what can come after. The conflict was, of course, not unexpected. As we all know, the conflict has been going on for about 3 decades or even more. And during those 3 decades, in particular in the last 25 years, there had been a range of skirmishes and other violent clashes between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So the escalation to war was not entirely unexpected. During that time, however, there was widespread agreement within the international community that the conflict over the enclave should be resolved peacefully through negotiation, to mediation. In particular, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, through their so-called Minsk group, tried to mediate between the two parties. And one important aspect of that was also realization, especially within the OSCE, that a build-up of arms, a militarization of the conflict, the so-called frozen conflict, would not do any good. It would only risk escalating the conflict further. And as part of that, the OSCE had then also a standing request, as it was called, a voluntary embargo, you could say, in which they asked the OSCE member states or participating states to impose an embargo on deliveries of weapons and ammunition to Armenian and Azerbaijani forces engaged in combat in Nagorno-Karabakh. But that clearly didn't work that well because both sides had access to significant amounts of arms. And this is what we want to talk about. There has not been an in-depth assessment of how states have implemented the OSCE voluntary embargo. There has not really been an in-depth assessment of how those weapons flows have contributed to the escalation to actual war in 2020. We want to kind of delve into that and ask ourselves a number of questions there. But the case is for us a starting point to discuss more about arms flows controls in general. What has the international community done to shed more lights on potentially destabilizing arms flows that may provoke, prolong, or exacerbate armed conflict, in particular between states. So we want to feed into a discussion about how to ensure effective and consistent use of arms transfers controls. But the core of our discussion today will be about where do we get the information? How do we monitor arms flows in order to make those decisions about where to supply or not to supply arms, about how to implement those multilateral or national arms control mechanisms that exist. Information that is available through multilateral transparency instruments on, for example, the UN or OSCE level, but of course also the information that can be contributed by independent research organizations, some of which will be presented here in the meeting itself. Now, to do this, to have this conversation, we have invited 3 panelists here to talk from their different perspectives about, in particular, the access to information. What do we know about arms flows? And to start with, we will have Alexandra Kukimova, who is a researcher at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, specializing in the issue of international arms transfers, and also has a specific focus on the post-Soviet space in that regard. We also have Maud Julien, who is an investigative journalist who is part of the Lighthouse Reports group. And she will explain a little bit more what that means and what they do. But in essence, he uses new kind of open source information mining techniques to shed more lights on arms flows and also the use of arms in conflict. And then we have Himayu Shutani, who will be or already is the head of international policy at Conflict Armament Research, CAR, which is another research organization which uses yet another technique to shed more light on arms flows, mainly involving field research, but he will talk about it himself a bit more. He has also been the head of the Conventional Arms Program at the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research. Now, I've introduced the panelists here, and let's start then with Alexandra. Alexandra, from you, I would like to hear a little bit more about what actually happened in terms of arms flows to the warring parties in the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict. How can you sketch that?
Thank you very much, Peter. First of all, I would like to say that it is an honor for me to be a part of this important discussion. But to answer your question, Peter, I would like to start with some statistics on arms imports by Armenia and Azerbaijan over the last decade. Prior to the 6-week war over the Nagorno-Karabakh region in 2020, both Armenia and Azerbaijan invested in modernizing their armed forces. This included procurement of different types of weapons. According to the data from the SIPRI arms transfer database, the volume of Azerbaijan's arms imports over the last decade, the decade 2011-2020, was 8 times higher than those of Armenia. On the global level, over the last decade, arms imports of Azerbaijan accounted for only 1% of all exports of major arms in the world, while arms imports of Armenia accounted for even less than 0.5% of global arms transfers. Although these shares seem very low, it is important to highlight that many of the weapon systems delivered to both countries over the last decade, or even earlier, played an important role in the 2020 war. So what can you say about arms transfers to Armenia? Over the last decade, Russia was the largest arms supplier to Armenia. It supplied nearly all of Armenia's major imports, 94%. Russia delivered various types of weapon systems, including tanks, air defense systems, multiple rocket launchers, and many of these weapon systems delivered were actually used in the 2020 war. For example, we know that Russia delivered to Armenia Iskander surface-to-surface missiles. With these systems, Armenia was capable of attacking key targets deep inside the other's territory. And according to various media reports, Armenia used one of these missiles against a target deep inside Azerbaijan during the 2020 war. Armenia also reportedly used Merch rockets supplied by Russia 5 years ago. Those just an examples. Of course, there were more cases when we saw the use of weapons during the war last year. Arms exports often support economic, political, and security interests of a supplier country. In the case of Russia, arms export to Armenia mainly seem to support its political and security interests. Russia's arms export to Armenia mainly seem also to support military cooperation between these two countries. Russia's arms exports are part of Russia's broader military cooperation, which is carried out within several bilateral agreements. Armenia hosts Russian military bases, and also Armenia is the only member in South Caucasus of the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So to support this strategic cooperation, Russia often supplies weapons to Armenia at reduced prices, likely with an aim of maintaining influence and presence in the region. So what do we know about arms transfers to Azerbaijan? So let's look at Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan's weapon arsenals are quite diverse. Over the last decade, Azerbaijan received arms from different arms suppliers, including Russia, Israel, Belarus, Turkey, Slovakia, Spain, and other countries. But I will focus today on the largest arms suppliers. So Russia was the largest supplier of major arms to Azerbaijan as well. It accounted for 60% of Azerbaijan's arms imports. Israel was the second largest arms supplier, accounting for 27% of Azerbaijan's imports. Over the last decade, Azerbaijan received armed vehicles, air defense systems, transport and combat helicopters, and tanks from Russia. So we can see that it's various different types of weapons have been received. As in the case of Armenia, various media and investigative reports show that these weapon systems were used during the war last year of the Nagorno-Karabakh region. Russia supplied, for example, Smerch multiple rocket launchers, which reportedly were used by Azerbaijan against populated targets in Nagorno-Karabakh last year. Unlike arms transfers to Armenia, exports to Azerbaijan seem to support Russian economic interests. According to official statements, Azerbaijan spent billions of US dollars on Russian military equipment. As I mentioned already, Israel was the second largest arms supplier to Azerbaijan. Israeli supplies included unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, for reconnaissance, ballistic missiles, loitering munitions. And although we know that little or even no information is available on the actual numbers of weapons delivered, we know that many of these weapon systems were used in the war with Armenia. For example, there are reports that Azerbaijan used a LoRa ballistic missile in an attempt to destroy a bridge in Armenia. Belarus was the third largest supplier of major arms to Azerbaijan over the last decade. Deliveries from Belarus included a few ground attack aircraft, air defense systems, tanks, artillery, and guided rockets. Turkey was the fourth largest arms supplier to Azerbaijan. Over the last decade, Turkey supplied to Azerbaijan rocket artillery, missiles, armed UAVs, and the armed UAVs, some of them, were actually delivered shortly before the 2020 war. This included at least 5 Bayraktar TB2 UAVs armed with guided bombs, which media report suggests were ordered to increase Azerbaijan military leverage over Armenia. The Turkish-made Bayraktar UAVs were reportedly used by Azerbaijan to strike Armenian mobile surface-to-air missile systems. Through strengthening relations with Azerbaijan, Turkey also appears to be expanding its political presence in the region, notably in competition with Russia, which is currently the dominant power in the region. I think I will start here, but of course, if there are questions, I'm happy to answer. Peter, you're muted.
So, I mean, there were a few other countries too which have been supplying arms, and I understand that amongst the ones you already mentioned, several are member states or participating states in the OSCE, and apparently have interpreted the request to limit their arms supplies to forces engaged in combat in Nagorno-Karabakh in a very particular way. They didn't seem to have many restraints. Do I understand that right? Can you say a bit more about that?
Yes, absolutely. So as you mentioned, we know that there is a voluntary embargo on arms exports. So this OSCE voluntary embargo has been interpreted and understood differently by many states. Since it is a voluntary arms embargo, a number of OSCE participating states have been supplying arms to Armenia and Azerbaijan for decades. There has been, what we noticed, that there has been an apparent lack of interest in restrictions on arms suppliers to Armenia and Azerbaijan by several OSCE members. Even if we know that these two countries have been regularly involved in skirmishes, which indicated a high probability of large-scale hostilities already well before 2020 war. So with regard to different interpretations of how to implement the OSCE embargo, as I said, the different countries decided to choose different approach. I will give you a couple of examples to see the variety of these approaches. So, for example, Germany decided to not to allow export of any military goods to Armenia, Azerbaijan, not only to forces engaged in the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, but in general to Armenia and Azerbaijan. At the same time, the United Kingdom interpreted this arms embargo as embargo on weapons supplied or military equipment supplied to forces engaged in the conflict. Another example is France. For example, France repeatedly stated that it respects the OSCE voluntary arms embargo. However, Azerbaijan claimed that there were negotiations for procurement of arms between Azerbaijan and France. So at the same time, as part of efforts to mitigate the risks of arms transfers, OSCE participating states have agreed to share and publish information about their arms exports to contribute to detection of destabilizing accumulation of arms. However, this reporting varied significantly between suppliers, and therefore it is hard to assess the actual amount of weapons transferred or delivered by many states.
Okay, thanks. Himayu, maybe we can broaden the discussion a bit, also a bit beyond this particular conflict. And I'd like to ask you, okay, so we have the OSCE, they have certain efforts, they even have a voluntary embargo. What can you say is more, what can you tell us more, what kind of other multilateral efforts there are to control arms flows to the kind of conflict that we have seen between Armenia and Azerbaijan? And those states which are not part of the OSCE, how would they have to take that into account? Do they have to take anything into account? What can you tell us more about that? And in that relation to, because I understand you have looked also a lot about at the international arms flow monitoring systems that exist, how does that relate to the amount of information that is available or not? And I think Alexandra has already mentioned this whole kind of the issue that in this conflict, yes, there are instruments, but they don't tell us that much, or at least not enough. A lot of information is missing there.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And Alexandra, very insightful information here. So it's a very good place to sort of kickstart my sort of intervention on this. First, there are multiple entry points at the multilateral level that facilitate the monitoring of arms flows. But I think that the key element here to emphasize is that objectives of such a monitoring mechanism matters. Because there may be common understanding or shared understanding that when we talk about monitoring, it often relates to illicit flows or, let's say, diversion of arms from authorized to unauthorized recipients. But in fact, as Alexander noted, a large part of monitoring also applies to monitoring the flows that may be destabilizing in nature or excessive accumulation in nature. In other words, the objective is to build confidence in that they will not contribute to the escalation of ongoing conflicts. Now, if we understand this context, that it's not only about illicit arms flows or diversion, then these tools become quite widened in terms of mechanisms that are available at the multilateral level. And of course, many are familiar with these, but these include from the United Nations, the UN Register of Conventional Arms, that include the 7 or 8 categories of conventional armaments that are voluntary in nature that states, participating states or all states can, let's say, report on. And some of the countries, of course, Alexandra noted, do report to these mechanisms. There are others though. These include the UN Contrade, which is basically the statistical trade database that looks at the exports and imports of items that include military items. And most recently, the Arms Trade Treaty. It also has a platform or a forum where its state parties, it's not universal yet, but its state parties have an obligation to share annual reports on exports of items. Now, there are informal mechanisms as well. And of course, SIPRI is one of them. Small Arms Survey and others also have databases that monitor the flows of arms. I think the most important element of all of this, Peter, is that while they are very good starting points to shed light on the actual transfers, illegal transfers or trade of conventional arms, it is actually far from the comprehensive picture in practice. And this is due to the, let's say, variations of these reporting mechanisms, either by membership, information requirements, domestic classification of some of these items, as Alexander was talking about the types of weapons. It also may be various in terms of the information being reported by these states, despite the, let's say, information that is being sought. Now, what this means is that the complete picture on, number one, the volume, and number two, the type, and number three, the destination. And when I say destination, it's also the ultimate recipient. And this is quite an important clarification, because when you talk about parts and components or UAVs in these contexts where they can be assembled and subsequently re-exported, all of this make it a very challenging task simply to work with these tools. Now, let's talk a little bit more specifically about situations of armed conflict. Yes, of course, many are familiar. In the United Nations, we are talking about the United Nations Security Council arms embargoes as a tool to facilitate the prevention of excessive and destabilization accumulation of flows into armed conflict zones. Now, in this current panel context, one might note that this does not apply, but there are tools and practices that are applicable cross-cuttingly. And these include most recently, or most frequently, prohibitions of certain items of transfer of military items and related material into a zone that is experiencing a conflict. But it could also include technical or financial assistance. I'm mentioning this because, Maud, I think you're going to talk a little bit about this, the paper trails about monitoring that comes into play. Now, what I want to emphasize as well, Peter, is that this alone is not sufficient. There are tools that supplement these, let's say, restrictions. And more commonly observed, let's say, tools that accompany this are sanctions committees, panels of experts, post-delivery, let's say, monitoring mechanisms that can be put into place to enable better facilitation of monitoring. But one thing I do need to note here is that a lot of this depends on a number of factors. Number one, mandate. Number two, political will. Number three, it also needs to depend on the capacity of entities that are mandated to monitor them. So access is a big factor. Now, Peter, if I could just continue very briefly, there's an additional components here too that is not strictly arms embargo related. This includes, in this context, ceasefire monitoring. And this is very important to highlight as a separate item, because ceasefire monitoring may apply to flows of arms itself, but they could also have additional confidence building measures that can actually shed light to monitoring purposes. And this commonly includes refraining from certain types of attack that are indiscriminate in nature, that can be seen as violations of international humanitarian law, or restrictions on use of certain categories of weapons that can be, when used, contribute to grave human suffering. And these are often incorporated into ceasefire monitoring. And what this means is that through such a mechanism, it is also possible to monitor at a multilateral level some of the flows. Now, I want to conclude my initial point by also recognizing regional interventions, because this is crucial. In the EU, Alexandra, you already noted about the voluntary OSCE arms embargo. But I think one thing I want to just add a layer to in terms of interpretation is that when it comes to European Union in particular, you are familiar that there is a European Union common position. And that common position is quite explicit in noting that an export license shall be denied if it is inconsistent with international obligations of member states within the European Union, United Nations, but also OSCE. So in other words, actually, depending on your interpretation, it begs the question is if the voluntary OSCE arms embargo is in fact voluntary for European Union member states. Now, of course, the member states you talked about in terms of transfer that was really insightful may not all be OSCE member states or European Union member states. But I did want to make this point that there are interpretations that are open here. Now, additional point maybe to maybe note, Peter, is that there are early warning systems as well that have been exercised as a tool. Now, one of the challenges of early warning systems is indicators. What our research indicates is that when we look at indicators of regional organizations that have more, let's say, early warning systems, there is a deviation or a gap, let's say, between the types of actors that are being, let's say, monitored to the types of flows and the items and its use. Meaning that oftentimes these risk indicators are seen in isolation. So what do we mean by this? It means that better integration of this information is necessitated to actually monitor flows more comprehensively. So to conclude on this initial point, Peter, all of these mechanisms really depend on a foundation to be effective. These foundations include political will, as I noted, existence of national laws and procedures, because if it's not necessarily mandated at the national level, it's going to be difficult to exercise some of these practices. Third, capacity and knowledge to implement and enforce these laws, and maintenance of records and access to these records are all prerequisites. And I think to conclude there, I will just mention that consistency also matters. Because if you track something for a period of time, but you stop and you discontinue it, it's going to be more difficult to understand the baseline of the flows. So which means that subsequently it's difficult to know if something is escalating or de-escalating in terms of the flows that are going into a conflict zone. Maybe let me pause here and hand it back to you. Thanks, Peter.
Yes, thanks, Imaya. I think you gave a lot of insights there and how this can work and how this does not work. In the meantime, we got a question here, and one of the questions is, how do we understand the Russian behavior, the Russian reasons for exporting arms to Azerbaijan and Armenia at the same time? Now, I don't think I want to dwell onto that very much, but I would like to ask Alexandra here. I mean, we've looked at that, and maybe in terms of transparency, can you say a few words about, well, the difficulties of, I mean, on the one hand, we already said that it's hard to monitor the arms flows, that information is missing, but even more about the motives. What can you say in a few words, what the obstacles are which we've seen?
Yes, thank you, Peter. And of course, thank you for the question. Normally, when we look at arms trade, we understand that arms transfers, arms exports can be used as a tool to perceive foreign policy objectives or to support economic interests. That is not a novelty. This is something that all major arms suppliers follow or do, and Russia is not an exception here. So with regard to arms transfers to Armenia and Azerbaijan, Russia often, Russia supports, of course, its foreign policy goals, which is to maintain presence in the region. But also, Russia would like to support, Russia wants to support its economic interests, because by selling arms to Azerbaijan, for example, Russia gets revenue, which is not that significant compared to, for example, revenues from selling oil and gas to countries. But at the same time, in terms of manufactured products, selling of arms to Azerbaijan do give some revenues to Russia. Also, maybe it is worth mentioning that a couple of years ago, the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, one of the interviews, he mentioned that they transferring arms to Armenia and Azerbaijan to actually maintain military balance in the region. So in a way, he mentioned that by supplying arms, they want to control what weapons countries receive. Of course, this is interesting statement by the former president, but Russia never elaborated on this. So there was just one interview when the former president mentioned this, but it wasn't discussed further.
Thanks, Alexandra, for shedding a bit of light there, and also that last point of it wasn't explained further, the kind of lack of information we have, not just about the actual flows, but also about the actual motives. What is it that drives these countries to continue to supply arms despite the major questions that can be raised? But when it comes to flows again, if we look at the conflict in Azerbaijan, in Armenia, how that war was fought out, the kind of technology that was involved, there's a lot more we need to know to really understand how such arms buildups take place. information is missing. We at SIPRI collect information from open sources, but we know that there are many items, many technologies, many potential transfers that we actually miss. And there are new ways, you could say, using old intelligence methods, but now being used by civil society organizations that can shed some light on this. And this is where we have Maud coming in. First, Maud, could you shortly explain what it is you do, what you work for? Just very briefly, kind of what is the objective of your work on arms flows?
Sure. So the work I've done on arms flows has been basically with a Dutch NGO called Lighthouse. It's a media organization, a nonprofit organization that puts together what it calls boot camps, which are essentially temporary newsrooms. So I'm a freelance journalist and was also doing these news stories for Arte, which is a French German public TV channel. So the idea is to put together these temporary newsrooms in several EU countries. So the project is called EU Arms. And in these newsrooms, you have journalists like myself, but also human rights lawyers and really people who are sort of open source experts. So people who know how to use tools, who are quite technical. And so we all get together and spend it can be a week, or, you know, recently we've done a session online and that lasted for several months. And we try to specifically track where EU manufactured weapons end up. So when in France, we did one boot camp with French journalists, and we looked at French made weapons in different conflict zones. And what we have in mind as we do this as a sort of journalistic question is, what treaties are being violated, or can the countries that we're in, or can the EU countries be sure that these weapons are not being used in violation of the treaties that Himayu mentioned. So essentially the EU common position in the AT tier, mainly the ones that we looked at.
So you kind of create, you could say, a civil society intelligence network trying to kind of also build up capacity through these boot camps, so that more and more people can work with this and can feed into that information flow about arms transfers. Now, as you say, you are based in Europe, and you're primarily looking at the European angle there, and that is probably the reason why you haven't yet looked at the case of Nagorno-Karabakh. But still, despite that, I'd like you to kind of go a little bit deeper into what these particular methodologies mean. Give us a few examples of how this is being used. And maybe also, when you do that, explain to us that this is not just civil society that uses these techniques, but that there are also, for example, UN panels that use very similar techniques, just to highlight the fact that it's, how to say, not only journalists, but that there's also a wider kind of research community which tries to integrate these new techniques in their research work. So please go ahead, and different from other panels during this forum, you will have the opportunity to share your screen and show us a few examples, because this really has to be visualized to make it really kind of easy to understand, I think. So please, Maud.
So I've sort of picked out two examples because they're both, I think pretty easy to understand, and also quite different in terms of the methodology of how we did it. So during the French boot camp, we decided to look at French ships in the context of the Yemen conflict. And so the starting point for this was that we knew that the Arab coalition owned frigates and corvettes. And this we know, by the way, through looking at SIPRI and other sources. So we know, we identify the weapons that we're looking for, and then we essentially go fishing on the internet for a while. So you need quite a large amount of time and people to do this. I mean, we spent probably 2 days just looking through YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, etc., with keywords in Arabic. So we translate them into Arabic, and then we look for things. And then on day 2, we had a kind of a breakthrough, I can say. So I can show you what we found. Desktop. Do you see it? Do you see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And so we found this video, just literally looking through things, and we found lots of different videos of ships enforcing the blockade on the Yemeni coast, which, by the way, it was causing starvation of civilians in Yemen. That's why we were interested in looking at it. And here, basically in this video, you can see, I don't know where, the Corvette is here. And so that's unmistakably a French Corvette. And then what we do from this video then is to try to get as much information from this video that we can analyze, and to try to verify that this video is indeed off the coast of Yemen, first of all. We try to identify the ship in itself, etc. So there's a document here where, you know, we can see the detail that we picked out from the video. So here, Al Dafra, we had the reference of the ship. Then this is the ship that they stopped, which, you know, we were also able to get information from the video, and we were able to verify that this ship was existing and in fact circulating in the Red Sea at the time. And then perhaps most importantly is the actual geolocation of the video. And so here, this is also another screenshot from the video, and it's just using this skyline in the background and Google Earth Pro and another website here where you can just actually see mountains across the globe. So that's another website that allows you to specifically do that. And then we were able to geolocate that ship right here. What was interesting is that there was also another edit of this same video online, which shows at the very least that this is actually a second one that we found, but there's another edit of this video, which shows that basically there were several journalists there on the same day. So that kind of confirms that this was all filmed at the same time, because that's another concern with open source material. And then we also, during that same boot camp looking at Yemen, found a second video, which we were able to analyze in a similar fashion, of frigates, this time used by the Saudi on the coast of Yemen. And again, we were able to identify the ship and the ship that was being stopped, and geolocate it as well. And so then that was widely broadcast actually on the French media as the first visual evidence of French ships being used by the Arab coalition to enforce the blockade on Yemen. And then
so I mean, just to say, so I think you've really showed an example of how, with quite a lot of work, quite a lot of time being spent on it, you find information which contributes to a broader awareness of the potential risks of arms exports, arms transfers, as they may be used in conflict. And I know you have another example which relates to Turkey, which in a way kind of also links to the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict due to the involvement of Turkey there. But just a question came in now. Can we talk also a little bit more about enforcement? Now, we haven't really talked about that in preparation of this meeting, but I think the issue of enforcement comes maybe also back into your discussion of the Turkish Libya case, again also considering the role of this type of techniques, which is also being used by, for example, the United Nations panels of experts that monitor UN arms embargoes. So keep that in mind when you take the next example, please.
To keep in mind the idea of how we can better enforce.
How this kind of technology can be used in different types of enforcement, but and potentially also can be used by those authorities in the exporting states that have to make judgment about the risks that weapons are being used.
Well, in the case actually of the Turkey and Libya, which is my next example, it was even more straightforward than this. And in fact, if I may say this, I think that the evidence is is undisputable. So what we did, and let me open the right one, is this time we decided to look at the Airbus A400, a cargo plane used essentially to transport large military equipment. And so we knew that Turkey owns 9 and has a 10th one that is being made or about to be delivered. And we found the registration numbers of these 9 A400s and just put all of these through on here, search them on flight tracking websites. So FlightAware, Flight Radar, there are several of these. And this was at a time when Turkey was building up its military presence in Libya in support of the GNA. At the time, there was a worrying escalation on both sides. And so here, the date was June 2020. And you can just see very easily here the flight departing from Istanbul and landing in Misrata. And this was, if I can remember how many flights there were at the time, but it was a lot. I think it was about 20 flights in a few months. We've done this a while ago, so apologies, I don't remember the exact figures, but there we found a lot of these flights going from Istanbul and to Libya, Misrata or Tripoli. So it was literally that easy to do, and of course there's a UN arms embargo on Libya, and the terms of that are quite clear and quite strong. And then we did some more evidence as well, building up on Misrata itself using Google Earth Pro, but I don't know if you want me to explain that, Peter. Or...
I think, considering the time and all that, I think there's one very important question you would have to go into, and it's of course, what are the risks using these kind of OSINT methods to shed more light on arms flows? What are the limitations? I think you mentioned already the time it takes and all that, but especially what are the risks? How can you be fooled?
It's funny because when you ask the question risk, to me as an investigative journalist, there's a much lower risk than in other investigations, because we're effectively looking for information that's not readily available to the public. So it's not coming from institutions. And so usually as an investigative journalist, when you want this kind of information, you're asking someone to take a risk, or you're looking for a source. And in this case, it's information that's already out there. It's just up to you to make sure that it's completely solid, and that's where the difficulty comes in, and where it's not always possible. I mean, for example, in the case of the Yemen blockade story that I told you about earlier, when you have material like this, that's, you're not entirely sure who posted it, how it was filmed, when it was posted. So there are all these things that you constantly need to be aware of. Also, the fact that you're not on the ground, so you really need to make sure that you're getting other sources, that you're not only relying on this material. You need to be, in a way, even more cautious and skeptical of the material that you find.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Yeah, and that gives us an idea of how that kind of information can be used. And then I would like to turn then to Himayu. And asking, Himayu, can you tell us a little bit more about the different methodology that the organization which you are going to work for very soon already have started to work for, conflict armament research? And also keep in mind again that question about, okay, we have this kind of information, how can this be used in enforcement? How can this be used in risk assessments that states want to make or have to make, depending on how you see that? What are the advantages and disadvantages of the kind of work that control armament research does?
Yeah, thanks, Peter. Let me just start first by that, what I began the initial intervention with, which is, let's be very clear about objectives here, right? About what are we actually trying to do? In situations where there are no, let's say, council mandated arms embargoes, then we're really, not always, but frequently talking about confidence building measures rather than enforcement, right? So I think that's very important to highlight and clarify, because it is states' prerogative to export items that they've deemed necessary in their, as Alexander said, commercial or policy interests. So, objective here is very important. Now, in situations where there may be arms embargo in place, regardless of the interpretation of those embargoes, right? Then I think there's really multitude of techniques that are available. And the most important, but the most challenging is, how do we know if something is changing, right? In other words, what's your baseline? What I mean by this is, what do you have? Where is it coming from? How is it being used? And how is that changing over time? And that is a fundamental technique for monitoring, because without that, there isn't really a way to know if something is destabilizing further or not. So in this case, baseline of holdings and flows are key, but it is the most challenging factor without a strict mandate for it. And even if there's a mandate for it, participation, or let's say willingness of states to participate in sharing this information is highly, highly sensitive. And I would just frankly say it's rare. That said, it's not impossible. For example, we know that in council experiences, there are things called notifications. These are things like supplying states may be mandated to notify in advance for delivery what they're sharing. Recipients may be also mandated to or obligated to report in advance of a reception what they're receiving. These all small components help build a bigger picture. Now, there are additional components that relate to this that is embedded in what we call end user controls or end user documentation. And this basically is a communication tool between the supplier and the recipient to say, what is it that you need? How much do you need? For whom do you need it? And how are you going to use it? Now, that information is rich because it can really form an informing basis of what is it that is actually going to change in that baseline. So that is another important area of information that you can dig into, and it is something that is commonly used in investigative techniques. Now, there was a question, however, an important one about enforcement. Let me just slightly adjust that, right? And talk about it in terms of informing decision-making, if I may. So rather than talking about it strictly from an enforcement perspective, let's talk about it from a decision-making perspective. First and foremost, as you noted, Peter, there are export risk assessments that many states either do already or are, let's say, obligated to do with regards to national laws or international treaties that they've signed on to. And here, I think the important thing to focus on is, in terms of techniques, is what are the indicators that they're looking at? Because that can really inform the decisions that are being made and what to monitor in this regard. And the second thing that is less discussed, but is worthy of a conversation, perhaps not now, but in this conversation, is how does states accept that risk when they export an item, right? And there's not enough discussion right now about acceptance of these risks, because it fundamentally goes to the enforcement question to say, if an item that is being shipped is going to have a risk of use by violation of international humanitarian law, international human rights, or other grave organized crime or serious crimes, the question needs to be asked about the risk indicators. They need to also be asked about how are they accepting that risk. That's one point. Now, there are additional techniques, Peter, that I think it's worthy of noting. And this is something that, conflict armaments research, but others also do. It's one of them is intermediaries. This is crucial. In any movement of an item, it's rarely one party to another party, because military equipments in different formats have different life cycles, and they may move from one custodian to the another. So industry supplies, logistical players play a crucial role in this building of the picture. And oftentimes they have transactional records. And sometimes records sit with them more than with certain states. So, if you're trying to build a bigger picture here, intermediaries are crucial. Another one is post-delivery information. What I mean by this is that often, more frequently, we're seeing that states put in place obligations of the recipient to handle certain items of high risk with more care. And these could include confirmation of delivery, let's say verification of those deliveries if it's agreed as part of an agreement of the transfer. It could also include things like conditions being placed on how these items can be used. Why do I mention this? I mention this because in terms of monitoring, those post-delivery, let's say, measures act as benchmarks. And they can be quite useful in investigative techniques. Lastly, I want to just build on Maud's point on intelligence or open source intelligence techniques. Our research or colleagues at conflict armaments research have indicated that that technique may be quite useful for certain categories of items, in particular, larger calibers or larger systems of conventional weapons, because they're quite uniquely identifiable. It becomes slightly more challenging. It's not impossible, slightly more challenging to build a bigger picture when it comes to things like the ant trade, what we call smaller volumes or frequent movements of smaller categories of items. It is possible to trace them, but to talk about it in a larger volume of flows, it is a much harder exercise to undertake. It also could be applied to parts and components that are maybe assembled later. It's not impossible, but if you're talking about accumulation over time, it really takes capacity. And number one, and number two, all of this have to be looped back eventually to a decision-making point of view, right? Because unless it's looped back to those who are originally exporting, and assuming that there's goodwill there to change practice based on what they're finding, that loop back without it, it's not going to change any behavior. And so here, I think that there are some caveats, of course, that I just mentioned, but these are some of the key, or let's say more commonly observed techniques that we have seen multilaterally. Thanks.
Thanks, Himai. I mean, you kind of already talk about technology transfer as an issue, and there's a question about that too in the question and answer box, which basically says, okay, we look at the conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh, it has been argued that certain new types of technologies, in particular armed drones and so-called loitering munitions, which is a new type of, let's say, relatively small but very precise missiles, play an important role. And of course, if you then focus on kind of the classic weapon systems, the tanks and the artillery, you might miss the impact of such force multipliers. I was wondering, Alexandra, can you say very little about how we at SIPRI encountered that particular problem that we kind of, you could say, increasingly misinformation because of the difficulties to focus on certain types of weapon technology that seem to be becoming increasingly important on the battlefield?
Thank you, Peter. Yes, of course, I can, maybe I can mention a couple of words about our way of working with open sources and therefore what difficulties we face when we work with open sources. So as I mentioned, we work with open source information, and this includes different types of publications, media reports, press releases published by the arms producing companies or official statements. And of course, we look at the UN ROCA registers and OSCE reporting. We try to collect information from different sources. But speaking of the limitations, is that in some cases, we receive information from open sources, which is more comprehensive sometimes than the information provided to international transparency instruments. However, often sources, open source information provides only partial information with regard to certain things, for example, delivery dates or exact numbers of weapons that has been transferred. I mentioned it with regard also to Israeli weapons to Azerbaijan. And this makes it difficult to assess the whole transfer and whether it happened or not, when it happened. And also, we should take into account that we looked at open source information from different sites. And of course, if we look at the reports published by the opposing parties or conflicting parties, and there are certain disagreements with regard to arms transfers, especially to conflict areas. Therefore, I should say that SIPRI always tries to make informed, cautious estimate on the volume of arms transfers and types of numbers of weapons delivered. However, sometimes it's just impossible or really hard. Therefore, it makes it hard to assess the real impact of weapons transferred to the conflict areas.
Okay, thank you for kind of dwelling a bit more onto these kind of methodological issues which make it hard to really establish what the real arms flows are and how we should assess them, how we have to take into account new technology developments and all those things. What I think here is important, it's somewhere during the question and answer in the question box, there's also an observation, a question about, okay, but look, an arms embargo on those two countries would not have led to an actual solution. We needed another type of solution. The war was there to come. Now, that might be true to some extent, but the question remains still, to which extent has the continuous supply of arms, also particularly more advanced types of arms, led to one side or the other to make certain decisions to find it more plausible that they could win a war and therefore actually went about to start such a military offensive. When we want to understand that better, we need more information. We need more information about how this has been developed and how we can then process this information into some clearer answers on what actually arms flows may do to the escalation of conflict. To round this all off in the next 2 minutes or so, just a question to each of you. I'm not sure if you can answer it, but give it a try. How can we combine these different techniques that we have seen passing the review? Is it possible to expand, to improve our monitoring of arms flows using the kind of ideas that you have put forward, or is it just going to be very hard to kind of merge this all and to find the resources to actually afford this, to be able to do this by research institutions, by civil society? What can we do to use all that knowledge and that information that clearly is around, but how can we bring it together? Maud, do you have any views on that, any ideas?
I do think it is going to be down to political will. I mean, as Humayun said, you know, journalists, we do our role, which is to try to tell, you know, the governments, this is what you said you were doing, and this is what you're not doing. But these treaties exist for a reason. So I think that's where it's from my perspective, that's why it also matters to make sure that these topics are more and more in the public debate. And certainly I've seen how that has changed in France over the past few years, where it was hardly discussed at all. And it's still a difficult topic in France, France being the military nuclear power that it is. But I do think that there are reasons to hope that maybe things might change on the political level. I don't know what you think.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Alexandra, any views from your side?
Yes, I would actually like to support Maud, her points, because I will provide my take on this from a researcher perspective, from a peace researcher perspective. I think, first of all, I think it's possible to use all these mechanisms in order to identify arms transfers in our case, but I think we should also use this information. So we should continue disseminating this information and analysis with regards to arms transfers. And of course, we need to raise awareness on the harmful impact on arms transfers on conflict. I know that it has been discussed already substantially, but I think we should continue doing this. This is our mission as researchers. And this definitely will help governments and civil society engaged in this informed decision-making about arms transfers. And it is important to understand that even at the global level, the volume of transfers may seem low or insignificant. It still can be destabilizing and have catastrophic effects on the civilian population.
Thanks. I think those are very good points. Himayu, can you say in a very few words your final thoughts on this, and then we finish the panel?
Yeah, Peter, I've listened with great interest to my fellow panelists, and I have to say, arms transfers will always happen and it will continue to happen. And so the point here would be maybe three thoughts from my side. First, how can we improve information exchange? This is something that I think we need to think about more. There are many actors, many institutions already talked up in this conversation: OSCE, EU, UN, civil society, others. How can we better exchange information? This is something that is crucial as a takeaway point, and we must remember requirement of accuracy, discretion, confidentiality, and information protection when we think about these elements. And related to this, of course, is like just to continue to encourage states that are already parties to these instruments to continue to engage, to encourage them to continue to engage on reporting within the OSCE, within the EU, within the UN, so that more information can be shared. The second point is, in order to build this comprehensive picture, it cannot be done in silos. In other words, we must use all tools available, physical and non-physical. Physical as in, for example, border points, custom points, monitoring teams that are already there in situations like this, but also non-physical points, as Maud sort of shared the intelligence pictures or that are becoming much more available. How can we better use this together, not in silos, but together, is going to be key. And I think this is an area that merits further reflection. And lastly, this might be an obvious point, but more capacity and expert building is necessitated. I think that the more people who are trained to do this, including journalists and researchers, the better. They are a resource for organizations like the United Nations and OSCE to make use of, and states to benefit from. So I think these are the three key takeaway points in terms of improvements of information exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayo. Yeah, I think we already have done quite some information exchange here. I hope that the audience, that there are also many there who get inspired by that, maybe those who sit on this kind of information, who are involved in collecting this kind of information, and that they will be in contact with each other and with us to kind of broaden exactly what you said, that network, which will create a much more detailed and more time sensitive way of collecting information. With that, I really want to thank you all three for being here, for sharing your thoughts, for sharing your knowledge, for showing how this could be done. And I hope we meet again, and hopefully also again, as I say, in a framework where we try to kind of merge these types of information into one, where we really work together to shed so much more light on international arms flows and the potential negative effects of that. Thank you very much for being here with us, and thank you to the audience to having watched and listened to us, and to also sharing some of your observations and questions. We couldn't answer them all, but I'm sure you can be in contact with us directly if you want to know more, if you want to have a more clear answer to the questions which you have raised. Thank you everyone for this panel. It was really great. Thanks and goodbye.